Good to see you all. My name is Sean. I'm with North Branch Nature Center. It's a pleasure to have you. Is this anybody's first time to North Branch? Any chance? All right, super. Well, welcome. Welcome, and welcome back for everybody else. And welcome to Naturalist Journeys. This is the 29th annual Naturalist Journeys series. This program has always been about featuring the work of researchers and travelers and ecologists and authors and folks that are connected with the natural world in some way. But this year, we're looking at forest management and sustainable forestry. And our whole series this year is trying to understand from folks who work in forest management how they make decisions around managing trees and the forest through timber harvesting and all sorts of other kind of tools in the forester's toolkit to achieve different outcomes. So this is the fifth of our 6 talks in this series. Next week, come back this time a week from right now and hear Caitlin Cusack with the Vermont Land Trust to learn about how VLT thinks about prioritizing different sorts of lands for conservation, how they choose what to conserve and why. Before we get started, I want to thank all of our sponsors that make Naturalist Journeys possible. So big thanks to Hunger Mountain Co-op and 802 Coffee as our lead sponsors. Why don't we give them a round of applause? Thanks also to Stone Environmental, Onion River Outdoors, Washington Electric Co-op, Wade Heindel Environmental, and Orca Media for recording the whole thing, live streaming it, and making that possible. So thanks to Orca Media as well. And since I'm looking at all the folks that are live streaming in, welcome to all of you. You can put questions in the chat on the YouTube live stream as we go, and I'll moderate those at the end. So we'll do a Q&A at the end, so hold your questions till the end if you wouldn't mind. And if folks want to ask questions in the chat, I can feed those to Steve at the end of the talk. Let's see. Also just want to say thanks to all of you that supported Naturalist Journeys through a donation when you got your tickets or through your North Branch memberships. If you want to find other ways to support North Branch Nature Center, we will certainly help you do that. And you can find me or Emily after the program tonight. So yeah, thanks for being here.
What's the bird?
I'll ask you all. What's this bird? That is correct, scarlet tanager. Great. Great, all right, well, you all passed the test, so that means you have all qualified for this presentation. So with that, please help me welcome Steve Hagenbuch from Audubon, Vermont.
Great. Thank you, Sean. And don't worry, if you didn't get a chance to identify this bird, there will be more opportunities for audience participation. We always like to get folks involved in things. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I know from Sean that this is a long-running series. The Naturalist Journeys has been going on for over 20 years. And so to be invited to be a part of this, specific to thinking about forest management is for the birds, is a real pleasure to be able to be here with you all, and thank you for coming out here this evening. Since this is Naturalist Journeys, I thought I would start off by telling you a little bit about my journey. And about me and kind of who I am and where I come to all this from. I did actually go back and watch the other presenters who have presented in this series and saw that they did kind of the same thing. And I think that's kind of nice, so you can kind of hear what my experiences are, what kinds of things I've been engaged in, and how that helps to kind of define the work that I do here today. So a little bit about me. That's me, by the way, in my own maple sugar bush. I'm by training, a conservation biologist. Got my master's degree from Antioch University, New England, down in Keene, New Hampshire. I'm also licensed in the state of Vermont as a forester. So it is something that if you're going to practice as a forester, you need to be a licensed forester in the state of Vermont in order to do that. In addition to that, professionally, I'm also a farmer and a maple producer, kind of small scale with my family. We run a small farm in Waterbury Center called Sweet Bird Farm. There is a reason why it's called Sweet Bird. You might be able to figure out why, maybe. And I'm an outdoor recreationalist, so I'm out there hiking, biking, skiing, fly fishing, all the fun things that there are to do in the outdoors here in Vermont. Before I really was working within that space, though, I'm also an environmental educator, and I've shared a stint kind of as a backcountry and wilderness guide, taking youth on backcountry backpacking trips in the New Hampshire White Mountains and here in the Green Mountains of Vermont. And then finally, this all kind of came about because I am from a farming family. I grew up in Pennsylvania, so I'm not a Vermonter. I told my kids they won't be Vermonters either, because they're not going to be at least 20 generations. But nonetheless, that farming background has given me the opportunity, and I credit that for doing what I do today, just being able to be outside and enjoying the outdoors and taking things from there. So that's just a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm definitely someone who advocates for the working landscape as a way to achieve all kinds of outcomes, from supporting our food that we eat to the biodiversity that we share that landscape with. So putting that into context. So we will be talking about forest management being for the birds. I'm not going to ask you yet what this bird is, but you're going to see it again. So if you do happen to know what this bird is, just file it away and you can share that when we get to it a little bit later on. As Sean said, I work with Audubon Vermont. Well, sorry about that. I jumped ahead a little bit. Just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview to this evening. I will introduce you to Audubon Vermont and who we are and what we do. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of Vermont's forests to bird conservation and more, including to us as people. We'll meet some of the stars of the show, that being, of course, the birds themselves, and then discuss our collective responsibility to ensure that we have healthy forests for birds and people alike. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some questions and conversation about whatever it is that you would like to talk about. So Audubon Vermont, folks are familiar with Audubon, the National Audubon Society. You think of us as the blank people. The bird people, right. So we are a conservation organization with a mission to protect birds in the places they need today and tomorrow throughout the Americas using science, advocacy, education, and on-the-ground conservation. When I started with Audubon almost 27 years ago, I would say that we were very much a bird organization, really focused in on birds and bird conservation and education. Since that time, we've really morphed into a more holistic conservation organization, which does focus on birds and use birds as a way to engage people in thinking about conservation. I wanted to highlight the places they need part of this from our mission, because that's really what ties into the presentation here this evening. We've identified that the places that are really important to birds in the state of Vermont are our forests. And so Audubon Vermont has dedicated a lot of its conservation work over the last 15 or so years to thinking about our forests. We have the Healthy Forest Initiative as kind of this broad overarching way of describing our work. And then underneath that, we have kind of 3 program areas that really define all the things that we do. Woods, Wildlife, and Warblers is a partnership with the Vermont Woodlands Association, and it really involves our landowner technical assistance. So we do provide technical assistance in helping forest landowners to understand how their property can be part of the contribution to forest bird conservation. How can you steward that land in a way that supports bird conservation? We also have a newer program called Forester Training and Endorsement. This is where we're working with professionals, licensed foresters and other natural resource professionals, and getting them trained up and endorsing them for their ability to kind of show us and prove that they understand what it means to manage a forest with birds in mind, how to put that into forest management planning and actually implementation when they're doing work on the ground. And we have a variety of foresters currently who are endorsed by Audubon throughout the state working with private landowners. And then finally, our bird-friendly maple program. This is a program that works, as you might guess, specifically with Vermont maple producers, but we've also expanded it to other states as well. And we actually recognize them for their efforts to incorporate bird habitat when they're managing their maple sugar bush. And in doing so, in their agreement to doing that, we give them the opportunity to market their products in that way. So we have a sticker up there with that scarlet tanager, kind of the poster bird for bird-friendly maple. And there's other marketing materials that we provide them. It's a form of what we call market-based conservation, hoping that their conservation behaviors that we're asking them to partake in through that program can help their business by getting people excited about buying syrup that comes from a sugar bush that was managed with birds in mind. But back to that forest resource. Anybody know what percent of Vermont today is forested? About 80, 85, yeah. Close to 80. It's actually gone down a little bit over the last couple decades. We were at the 80 mark, and now we're down to about 78%. We're the fourth most forested state in the country. Maine first, New Hampshire second, West Virginia third, and then Vermont. And I think Vermont was number 3 up until a couple years ago, and West Virginia jumped in front of us. So we have experienced some loss of our forest cover throughout the state. And we ask a lot of our forests. There's many things that we expect them to do for us, whether we realize it or not, and many goods and services that they give us back in return. We're about to come into maple sugaring season. Vermont leads the country, right, when it comes to maple production. About 50% of all the maple syrup in the US comes from the Green Mountain State. We also have a forest products industry that relies on wood itself, and lumber and timber and some other forest products and things like firewood and pulp that go to mills for all kinds of different things that we use every day. And that's an important part of our rural economy. Recreation is a big one. It's expanding and growing rapidly in the state of Vermont. Mountain biking, backcountry skiing are all things that more and more people are doing to get out there and enjoy in the forest. And then, of course, the biodiversity aspects that we have, in particular, our bird communities that are here. So there's lots of things our forests do for us. There's lots of things we ask of them. And kind of the trick is to figure out, can these things all work together? Can we realize all of these benefits that we ask of the forest, while at the same time making sure that the other creatures that need it as well are finding the things that they need? So this is where we're going to start to really focus in on the bird part of things now. I do apologize if this is a little bit of a blurry slide, but I think you'll get the idea of it. I love maps, by the way. I think they do a good job of telling stories. This is a map that shows some of the results from a program called the North American Breeding Bird Survey. It's one of the longest running bird survey programs that we have in this country, going back into the 1960s. And it basically gets people out on the ground kind of tracking bird species that they find on these roadside routes. The warmer colors that you see here are the higher numbers of species, forest bird specific species, that have been encountered over these routes during a short time period. It's only 2004 to 2006, but nonetheless those numbers would still really hold true today. And the takeaway here is just to say, if you are looking for some of the highest numbers of forest bird species, what we would call species richness, where should you go? Your backyard. Don't go anywhere. Stay right here. Stay home. Stay in Vermont, right? So the northern forest region, Vermont, New York, the Adirondack Park in New York in particular, New Hampshire, Maine, down through the mid-Atlantic forest and the upper Midwest, really does support some of the highest number of bird species during the summer months, during the breeding season, of anywhere else in the country. Simply put, we're a big deal when it comes to forest birds. And we're really important for those forest birds to be able to find the habitat that they're looking for. That number, by the way, 31 to 41 species, is way on the low side. Remember, these are roadside routes, so they're not capturing some birds that you'd only find if you went more into the interior of the forest. Anybody want to take a guess how many different bird species in Vermont use forests for all or a portion of their annual life cycle? 100? Close. It's a good guess. Price is Right time. Higher. 150. Ooh, 200. So there are over 200 birds in Vermont, but they don't all use forests. It's about 120, 125, give or take, is the number of species that have been identified as utilizing forests. That's a lot of birds that are potentially out there using our forests. But they're not out there now. We're not going out there and finding lots of birds if we're snowshoeing or cross-country skiing, because a lot of them are migratory in nature. And so many of these we refer to as neotropical migrants. Anyone ever heard that term, neotropical, before? Essentially what that means, see that red line? Anybody know what that red line is? Tropic of Cancer. So a neotropical bird species is a species in which the majority of its wintering population goes south of the Tropic of Cancer and then returns back north of that during the breeding season. So being that we are in the winter season, a lot of these birds right now are in Mexico, Central America, and even as far as South America. And come May next year, late April into May, they will turn around and they will hopefully make their way back up here to our forest once again. So not a lot of birds out there now, but a lot of birds that will be coming as we get into the spring months. Okay, quiz time. Let's meet some of the birds. I'm not going to do a lot. I'm only doing 3 birds, but we're going to spend a little bit of time with each one of them. You've seen this bird before. It was one of the first slides that I showed you. One of the best things about the names of birds is that whoever named them, when they name them, they somewhat look like, in ways that look like their appearance, it's always helpful. Excellent. This is the black-throated blue, and then warbler is the group of birds that this particular one belongs to. We have warblers and thrushes and vireos and things like that. So this is within that warbler group, which there's a lot of different species that fall within that. So there's that. Now, this is the male of the species. When we see these really brightly colored males, and the scarlet tanager is another one that we saw in the very beginning, the flashy ones tend to be the males, and the females tend to be a little more drab. This is a black-throated blue warbler, but it's the female in the breeding season. Why do you think the females tend to not be the flashy ones? They're the ones that tend to be on the nest, incubating the eggs. And so they don't want to stand out, but the males do want to stand out. It's showing other males that they're in an area, trying to attract the mate. So being flashy is what it's all about. We're going to try and see if we can get a little advanced jump here on listening to the songs of these birds. This is one that if you spend time in the forest, you probably have heard at one time or another during those summer months. Hopefully this is loud enough. I'm not sure where that sound would be coming from. Is there a speaker on the...
Up above the screen.
Oh. Say, that helps. Anybody hear that? Okay. So the way that we often describe the song, it's a buzzy kind of rising up, bzz, 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 rising up to the blue sky. That's how I remembered it. The black-throated blue, it rises buzzy, rise up to the blue sky. And it's a fairly common bird that we find in our forests. Population-wise, it seems to be doing okay. But the important thing is that we are part of its core nesting habitat. So every year, this bird's coming back to our forest as kind of the core area where it's trying to nest and raise the next generation of its species. I'm going to try another thing here, too, and I'm not sure this is going to work, but it's kind of a fun feature if it does. Not going to work. It's working on my screen, but it's not showing up there. So this is a map that basically, it's an interactive map that shows where this bird is in the breeding season, where it moves in migration, and where we find it in the wintering ground. So it's really in the Caribbean islands is where its wintering location. Most of its population goes there, so that's where we'd find this bird now if we wanted to find it. Okay, so where would we find it when it's here in the summer breeding season? So it's in our forest that we might describe as a more mature, closed canopy forest. It's a place where you go in the summer months and it's 90 degrees outside in the sun, but you get in the forest and it's nice and cool because you've got lots of good canopy cover overhead, so kind of a high, tall, relatively closed-in canopy, but not completely closed in, because the most important feature within that mature forest for this bird to find nesting habitat is what we see down in the bottom of that maple sugar bush over there. You see the tubing that's running between the trees for sap collection. during sugaring season. But underneath that is a bunch of really low dense vegetation. This is another close-up picture of it with the nest itself of the black-throated blue warbler. Does anybody know what this plant is? And it's the same. Hobblebush. Right. Hobblebush is a native shrub that we find throughout Vermont, particularly as we go a little bit higher in elevation. So if you're going up over here on Mount Hunger or something, you'll get up and eventually you'll find a bunch of hobblebush growing. And it's not necessarily that it's hobblebush itself that the black-throated warbler is keying in on. It's the structure that hobblebush creates. When it grows in large patches, it's very dense, provides a lot of cover, and it's called hobblebush because if you try walking through it, it topbles you. It kind of trips you up because of the way it intertwines as it grows. So hobblebush and other vegetation that is within the first 6 feet or so of the ground is typically where we'll find the black-throated blue warbler putting its nest. If it is successful, it'll put out 2 to 5 eggs, which are incubated for up to 2 weeks, between 12 days and 13 days. And those young leave the nest after 8 to 10 days. So it all happens pretty quick compared to us. And when we raise up our kids, it seems to take a long time before they get out of the nest. But not for a black-throated blue warbler. They are out of there pretty quickly. When it's here, it's really feeding on insects. It's the main food source for pretty much all of these birds, the caterpillars, moths, crane flies, and spiders in particular for our black-throated blue warbler. But again, the key thing is the habitat. Will it find what it needs? That low, dense growth within a mature, kind of closed canopy forest. Okay, our next bird. Anybody want to venture a guess on this one? I'll give you a clue. It's not a hermit thrush. It's related to the hermit thrush. It's the wood thrush, right? So hermit thrush, people are familiar with it, and obviously it looks very similar to a hermit thrush being the state bird of Vermont. This is the wood thrush. One of the main ways you can tell the difference between a wood thrush and a hermit thrush, if you see it, is this spotting on the breast. A hermit thrush is going to be a little more muted and washed out, whereas the wood thrush has very noticeable spots on it. And then there's another thrush that we find down in the lower elevations, the veery, which is even more muted and washed out of its spots there on its breast. But this is our wood thrush. This is really kind of one of our priority species that we think about within our forests. The female here, though, looks pretty much the same. They don't have that dimorphism, or sexual dimorphism, where males and females look differently. In this species, they both look similar, and you could probably guess why. There's no need for them to look different, because it's kind of already blending in with its surroundings. We'll play the song here. Let's see if I can. It is similar to the hermit thrush, for sure. And one of the things that I listen for to help me determine whether it's a wood thrush or a hermit thrush, the hermit thrush usually starts with a single note before it goes into that flute-like melody that's there, whereas the wood thrush here kind of just rolls right into it. So a beautiful song, very ethereal. It's just like, I don't know, I'd say it's one of my favorites, but I say that about all the other ones too. So it is a very nice song nonetheless. For its habitat, kind of the same place where we find the black-throated blue warbler. It is also in these more mature, high canopy forests. But instead of looking for that really, really low understory layer, it moves up to a next layer of the forest. Black-throated blue warblers, I would say, they nest in the understory, that ground to 6-foot level. Wood thrush are going to be utilizing what I would refer to as the mid-story level, so from, say, 6 feet up to about 30 feet in height. The majority of them being 6 to 15 feet in height from the ground in some vertical fork of a deciduous tree, like you can see there. So in the image on the right, it'd be a lot of this kind of stuff in here is where we would expect that wood thrush to be putting its nest. Similar to the black-throated blue warbler, number of eggs that it lays, how long they're incubated, how soon they leave the nest, the diet that they eat, all very similar to one another. One of the big differences on the diet, whereas the black-throated blue warbler kind of gleans insects off the vegetation as it hops through the trees and shrubs, wood thrush will do that too, but they'll also dig around in the leaf litter on the forest floor. So a leaf litter layer that's nice and thick is going to be a nice feature for this species to have as well, to find the food it's looking for. It will add more berries and fruit as it finds them available, and in particularly as it starts to get ready for the fall migration. So just when some of our beautiful blackberries and raspberries and things like that are getting ripe is the time these birds are already starting physiologically to be getting ready for migration. So they start to feed on more of that, and that's what builds up the fat reserves. It's going to help fuel them in their journey, as long as it's good native fruit and not the fruit of non-natives, which have a different nutritional quality for these birds. And the last bird I'm going to introduce you to this evening, this beautiful little gem here. This is also a male because of some of the bright coloration that it has. Anybody know this one? Chestnut-sided warbler. So again, back to that warbler group, but this is chestnut-sided. And then that yellow cap, how about that, right? That stands out pretty nice. The female, here, let's get that chestnut-sided warbler up. And there's the female. So not a whole lot different, but she does lack one thing that the male has. The chestnut side really isn't shown there, it doesn't show up as much as it would in the male. And that makes it easier for her to be a little more hidden on the nest, apparently. I'm not sure why, but because the chestnut color you would think would blend in. But this is different habitat that we're going to find this bird in, and this is the song that we would listen for. I'll get to the habitat picture in just a moment. I'm not sure this is doing anything other than make me look silly. Yeah. It says, "Please, please, pleased to meet you." It's kind of the way many of us describe the song. Please, please, pleased to meet you. And this one, unlike the wood thrush and the black-throated blue warbler, we would not be finding in that more mature, high canopy forest. This one we're going to go to places that are more open, like that picture on the right. So this is where we're going to walk out in early July, and it's 90 degrees, and it's 90 degrees looking for chestnut-sided warblers because there's no big canopy overhead to shade us. So it tends to be more open canopy with a lot of low, dense growth, though, coming in. So that low, dense growth kind of is the key for a lot of these species to find good nesting cover. And there's the chestnut-sided warbler on a low shrub in a habitat like that. Less than 6 feet in height again. So the big difference, everything else is pretty much the same. They're eating insects, some fruit as it's available, the young are, the number of eggs, how long they're incubated, when they leave the nest, all very similar within a lot of these species. But the big difference being this habitat type. And those habitat patches that are going to be kind of open canopy like that, really ideally are going to be at least 1 acre in size. In order for the chestnut-sided warbler to be like, yep, that looks like the right habitat for me. If it's a small little opening of like a 1/10 acre or so in a more mature forest, we would not expect to find this bird or other young forest nesting birds there. So we need these patches that are at least 1 acre in size. The bigger they are, the more pairs of this species that will be able to be accommodated there. So if you had a 5-acre patch that looks something like that, you might find you have 3 or 4 different pairs potentially nesting in there. Whereas if it's only 1 acre, you most likely would only have 1 of them being there. So that's kind of fun, right? We've got some beautiful birds. They'll all be coming back soon. Hopefully, they'll all be coming back soon. Because unfortunately, not all of the news with these birds is on the positive side. This is some kind of staggering results that were published in 2019 from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. You might have heard the headlines. It actually made some of the national news. This 3 billion birds lost was kind of the tagline, 2.9 billion, but close enough. Since 1970 throughout North America. So kind of just see overall the trajectory of birds from 1970 down here on the x-axis and the number of birds lost on the y-axis. Really kind of a precipitous decline in a lot of those birds over that 30-year period, or more than 30 years, but actually that's a 40-year period they were looking at that. And if we drill into that a little bit deeper, specific to our eastern forest birds that we're focused on here this evening, we take our wood thrush. 6 and 10 wood thrush have really been lost throughout their breeding range since 1970. And that's significant. You know, not only are these birds beautiful to observe and to listen to, but they do play important ecological roles out there. And really, we've all heard the canary in the coal mine. Birds are great indicators of ecosystem health. So when something's going on with the birds, something's going on with the ecosystem that we're sharing with them. So what's happening? Why are these birds declining? As migratory species, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly one thing that's causing declines, because these are birds that are here in our Vermont forest in the summer months. Then they're migrating thousands of miles down the Atlantic Flyway to get to that wintering ground, where they spend a couple more months down on the wintering grounds. So there could be things happening in those 3 different areas, breeding, migration, and wintering grounds, that will affect their success and their ability to persist. The important thing to remember, though, is that when they're here, this is the breeding ground. This is the one place in that annual cycle where they have the opportunity to successfully raise the next generation of their species. So we think about here what our role is in all this. It's trying to make sure that they have places to be productive and successfully raising that next generation. So the main drivers of population declines that we often think about up here, some of them are being shown here. Up in that upper right picture there, we've heard about forest fragmentation, which is taking large blocks of forest and kind of fragmenting them into smaller, disconnected pieces. And that forest fragmentation then often leads to conversion, where we're taking land and converting it to some other use which may not be as hospitable for birds and other wildlife. So that's kind of an image showing a forest you can imagine at one point in time where all of those houses are. That was forest cover, contiguous, and it got kind of broken up and converted to open land with houses. And then we have all these other houses kind of now scattered in amongst the forest that is still there. On the left side here is another one of the big threats to any biodiversity. Anyone recognize that nasty plant? It's not knotweed, but that's a nasty plant. Yes. This is a honeysuckle. And there's lots of these non-native and invasive plants, as we often describe them as, that have come into places throughout Vermont and decrease habitat quality. I mentioned about the fruit that these birds will eat later in the summer. Honeysuckle is a prolific fruit-bearing shrub, and birds will eat that fruit. But at a time that it's critical for them to be eating a high nutrition food source and ready for migration, they're now eating something that they're not adapted for. They haven't evolved over time to the fruit that these plants provide. And so they leave here, if they gorge themselves on a lot of that, in a lower level of fitness than if they were eating the fruits of native plants. The other bad part about these non-native invasives for birds, what was the main food source during the breeding season for all these birds? Insects. Non-native plants host much lower abundance of insects than native plants do. So when we have landscapes that are dominated by non-native and invasive plants, the insect load does decrease, reducing the food availability for those birds during that critical nesting time of the year.
Why do they have less insects than invasives?
Why don't the insects?
No, why do invasives have fewer insects
Yeah.
than the native?
I think it's, again, because of the fact that these plants are relatively new on the scene, and our insects have evolved over time to the native plants that have been here for a long time. So this isn't the kind of thing that the insects are going to want to be feeding on either. That's my particular theory. I don't know if that's a scientific answer, but that's what my conclusion is with that. But we do know, it is proven, that there are fewer insects in the non-native plants than there are in native plants. And the other thing, too, that we don't hear as much about is cats. Hate to say it, but house cats do, this is documented, the number of birds that house cats can get, window strikes, all those things are things additionally that we bring into this landscape and can have negative influences on our bird populations as well. It's a bummer, right? But we don't want to be down. We want to come back up from this and be happy and think positively about this stuff. So before we do that, though, completely, let's think about who is it now that's going to be able to make decisions about how this landscape is being taken care of and stewarded, so that hopefully we can think about doing actions on the ground that will make it a better place for birds. Here's some stuff to kind of give us the answer to that. Big takeaway is most of Vermont's forest is in private ownership. So roughly, if you look at this graph, this pie chart here on the left, 64%, and this isn't as of 2014 data, but again, a lot of this hasn't changed that much. In family and individual ownership, I forgot to ask this before. I just kind of jumped into things. How many of you own more than 10 acres of land? Just a couple, okay. How many of you have forest management plans for that land? Okay. So you kind of fall within this 64% of the private ownership. We also have other private land, so all combined, you might have somewhere close to 70% of our forests in Vermont in some form of private ownership. Our public lands are a much lower percentage of that. State forests, Green Mountain National Forest is a lower percentage. The map on the right just kind of shows the distribution of that land, the green being the private forest, the yellow being the public lands, the public forest land out there. So we have private individuals and families owning a lot of this resource. What is it that they care about? I could ask those of you who are sitting here, what would you care about if you had land that you were responsible for? Would you match with the results of a lot of surveys that are being put out there where having a beautiful place that you can enjoy, protecting wildlife, protecting nature, as really some of the main reasons why you own land? Sometimes you buy a house and it comes with a house, but you still have some things that you're looking to do with that land, and oftentimes this is kind of a data set from New England at large, that the majority of our privately owned land, the goals of the landowners themselves tend towards protecting wildlife and nature. Having forest products like timber, way down there now. And this is a relatively new situation. If you went back 50 or more years ago, this would not have looked the same way. They would have been rearranged. And timber production probably would be higher up on the list. Non-timber forest products, that's even like maple, would have been higher up on the list. Hunting would probably be higher up on the list, but there's a change, right, in what people own land for here today. So we've got private landowners owning the majority of our forest land, and they care about wildlife and nature. Good, right? That's a positive thing. And because of that, we've seen some successes. So all the negative charts showing declines in birds, here is something showing that woodpecker species in North America have actually increased. So something has happened where people are making choices. And what is it that woodpeckers really like? Anybody know? A habitat feature? Standing dead trees, right? So whether or not there's an intention to people knowing that and making efforts to keep standing dead trees standing, it's possible, but that's a good thing. So we can make a difference through our stewardship. So with that in mind, let's go back to our birds that we've been introduced to. You can tell me when I point to them their names. Very good. Chestnut-sided warbler and wood thrush. Okay, what kind of places do these birds look for when they come to nest here? What is it that's really key for them as a place where they want to put their nest? different layers, right, of the forest. We call that structural complexity, right? Different vertical structure in the forest, not all the same height vegetation. Here's some images of some of that structure again, some low dense cover with some kind of mid-story trees over there as well. That's good. We'd like our forests to look like that, but our forests generally in Vermont don't look like that. They look like the picture you see on the left there. A lot of our forest land, due to past land use, the age of the forest today is in what we often refer to as the teenaged forest. It's not young forest anymore like the chestnut-sided warbler was looking for, which open canopy, real low dense vegetation. And it's not that real structurally complex older forest that has different layers of vegetation. It kind of falls in the middle in what we see here. This is a very common scenario in a lot of Vermont's forest land. So the question is, how do we go from that to getting that structure that those birds are looking for that would allow them to have greater success of nesting and raising their next generation? Any ideas? Magic wand. Make gaps. Ooh, small gaps. Uh-huh.
There'd certainly be a place for old growth and deep woods, deep
Yep.
interiors. And then I'm always thinking about people's yards and natural ponds, the edge effect where the warbler would be, and not necessarily making the acres, but the acres that people already have that are just bush hogs. Like those would be places to gain.
Yeah. So both great answers. I'm going to touch back on that one. Yeah.
What about deer and overgrazing?
That is a challenge to that, right? And I appreciate you bringing that up. I'm going to hold off on getting into that a little bit more, but let's make sure I don't forget about it and talk about it. So Vermont's land use history would say that over 100 years ago, instead of being 78% forested, it was 80% open, right? It was cleared for agriculture. As that land grew back, because Vermont land wants to grow trees. We let it alone, it'll grow. And we had this period in the 1950s and 60s where a lot of that previously open land was left go and was starting to grow back shrubby, like you're describing, kind of land people don't do anything with except brush hog it once a year, except they weren't brush hogging it. It was kind of growing back. We had some really high numbers of some of those young forest birds like chestnut-sided warblers and things that probably didn't exist back, pre-settlement times. But those kinds of habitats are valuable. We can take old fields that we're not doing anything with anymore and let them kind of grow back, let them reach a certain stage and maybe cut them back again, reset the clock, if you will, and then let them grow back up again. So that's one strategy for creating some of this habitat. The edges of lawns and forests can create this edge effect where we get usually some shrubby vegetation. Some birds will utilize that, but not all of them. Many of them prefer larger patches instead of narrow strips of some of that vegetation, but nonetheless it can be a strategy. But the key with all of that, all the things that you just mentioned, is that there generally is some type of disturbance. That sounds like a bad thing, doesn't it?
I just wanted to add, there's also just natural disturbance with wind and ice storms.
Yeah.
And all sorts of things.
So disturbance can be natural, or it can be human disturbance. Something that kind of changes the vegetation that is currently there. Here in Vermont, the biggest agent of natural disturbance would be things like wind events that might take down a tree here, a tree there, or maybe 3 trees in this little clump and 5 trees in that little clump. Or it's ice and snow that will come down. Remember the ice storm, 98? That was a big natural disturbance event, so those things will happen. And we as humans can also create disturbances through how we engage with the land and how we manage that land. But it all really comes back to this very important fact, that disturbance of some kind created by something is going to be key for getting some of those conditions that the birds are looking for. So through a very thoughtful and intentional forest stewardship planning process, using ecological forestry principles. How many of you have been to some of these other talks this series? You heard from Alex Barrett and Jess Weichel. I think this term ecological and Ethan Tapper, of course, when he did his book reading. I think this term ecological forestry probably was introduced. It's this idea that we use forestry, active forest management, doing so in a way that emulates how nature would manage itself. Instead of thinking of the forest as a commodity that we're managing simply for a product that we're harvesting, we're thinking about managing the forest as a forest and using the same sorts of disturbance patterns that nature would provide out there on its own. Audubon, Vermont, working with the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation back in 2012, created what we called the Foresters for the Birds program and Foresters for the Birds toolkit. And we have different silvicultural prescriptions. Silviculture is a big word. It basically means the art and science of controlling the establishment and growth and quality of vegetation in a forest to meet a particular goal. So we have things to integrate bird habitat into managing forests. And they utilize these ecological forestry principles. From there, we hope people will take that information and put it into a forest management or a forest stewardship plan. This is the cover sheet from my particular forest management plan for my property in Moortown, where I'm using ecological forestry as a tool with the primary goal of biodiversity enhancement, climate resilience, maple syrup production, and things like that. So I'm integrating multiple goals, but using the same tools to do it. Gap creation. That, I'm glad you said that. You're okay. So creating gaps in a forest, it's exactly what it sounds like. You have this forest with a relatively closed, dense canopy. And when we create gaps, we're actually removing some of the trees to create a small hole in the canopy to allow sunlight to reach down to the forest floor. Now, oftentimes, if we're mimicking natural disturbance, those gaps are pretty small. So we advocate for things down to 1/10 of an acre, which would be, imagine one tree falling down. The length of that tree on the ground is kind of the width of a gap that's about 1/10 acre in size. Or we could go up to even an acre in size, because sometimes these natural disturbance events do create bigger openings. If, however, we're thinking about managing for some of those young forest species like the chestnut-sided warbler, we might go even upwards of 2 acres in creating a gap in the forest canopy, again, to make the habitat that those particular birds are going to be looking for. They are area sensitive. Again, as I mentioned before, a 10th acre gap is not going to be a place where young forest birds are going to be going to, but they will be in some of these bigger gaps. Within those gaps, it's not cutting everything. It's retaining certain trees, some desirable trees. You can define desirable however you want, whatever your goals are. It could be that they're a mast-producing tree, like oaks that produce a nut that wildlife will feed on, or cherry, or something you want to leave behind within the gap. Because in nature, even when we get gap disturbances happening, it's usually not every single tree that comes down. There's still some trees that are left standing there. This is an example of that in the Coolidge State Forest, which was managed using principles from that Silviculture with Birds in Mind guide that I referenced. So it's some retention within the gaps. And then making these gaps irregularly shaped, but still maintaining a lot of the interior area to edge area. And that goes back to that point I made about birds don't generally like these long, thin, linear strips of habitat. They'd rather have a bigger core area involved. And this diagram is perhaps confusing, but I just want to show, explaining a little bit of what it means. This is, imagine the big blob is a block of forest, and the first time we enter into the forest to do some management, we cut these small gaps, maybe a 1/4 acre, we'll say. First one was the dark brown, and those were the shapes based on what the trees were there that made sense to harvest. Then we come back 20 years later, and in the same places, we now cut trees around that gap that was there. Now you imagine you have 20-year-old trees in that first block, and now you're removing some of the trees around the exterior of that. 20 years later, we come back to the yellow color, and we kind of do that in a systematic fashion. And then we left that dark green, we never did anything to it. And over time, you get this different, we call it the shifting mosaic of different heights and of vegetation, different species of trees too are going to be coming in there based on the availability of light now that maybe was not there before. And so that is one way that we utilize gaps to create this variable structure and complexity that birds would be looking for. Just kind of as general practice, some additional things that we think about, not necessarily for wood thrush, black-throated blue warbler, and chestnut-sided warbler, but birds in general, is increasing the amount of dead wood that we find in our forest. Here we're talking about things that we find on the forest floor, from very large logs like we see over there on the right, to even the tops of trees that were perhaps harvested, leaving that mess, if you will, lying on the forest floor. One of the recommendations that we've moved towards at Audubon is thinking about some of the guidance for how do we manage for old growth forest conditions on the landscape. And Tony D'Amato from UVM and Paul Catanzaro from UMass Amherst have a great guide with some guidance on how to create some of the conditions that old forests might have. So ideally, we'd be shooting for 16 to 20 trees greater than 20 inches in diameter per acre on the forest floor. That's a hard thing to get in our forests. We don't have that many trees that are 20 inches in diameter, but it's something to aim for. And that would get us closer to the kinds of conditions that our older forests might have, which are desirable conditions. And then if we are harvesting trees, leaving the tops, things less than 4 inches in diameter in the forest, provides good cover for birds and other wildlife. And I didn't forget your question, deer browse. Deer love to eat young trees. That's what they go into the forest, they'll eat sugar maple and oak, and they prefer to not eat beech and hemlock and things like that. But they'll eat a lot of the young trees that are growing, and in some places pretty much taking everything away. When we leave the tops of trees in the forest, it provides a barrier that deer are less likely to go into that searching for little seedlings as they grow. And eventually the seedling will become a small sapling and get above the browse line where the deer can't get it anymore. So one of the best strategies we have for reducing the impacts of deer is leaving our forest floors very messy after our management activities to help protect the regeneration of young trees and shrubs. I wanted to play this because one of the things with large logs on the forest floor that we often think of is they provide these drumming sites for ruffed grouse or partridge, as they're often referred to as. This bird is obviously on a large log. We found it 2 summers ago near the Green Mountain Audubon Center as we were walking down Sherman Hollow Road in a power line corridor. So this tree had been dropped, and this is the only time in my life I've ever seen this in real life. And you're going to see a video of it, hopefully. Oh, come on. So that's called drumming. It sounds like, if you hear it in the woods, it sounds like someone's trying to start a lawnmower out in the distance. Boop, 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 and it's just like so fast I can't even do it. That is the male's courtship, so he's trying to attract a mate, define territory. It's not a songbird, so it's not singing to do that, but it's drumming. And super cool to see that and to hear that.
Can you play that again?
It's hitting kind of the side of its body. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Didn't want to see it again. Okay. Back to the deadwood thing, though. We also went to standing dead, and this was mentioned a little bit before, too. These snags, as they're often called, standing dead trees, like you see on the right there. Going back to kind of the old growth targets for leaving deadwood standing, we've now gone to this 8 to 12 snag trees greater than 20 inches per acre as a target to aim for. You can see that snag on the right has some big cavities, some big holes in it. Some of those would have been excavated by this bird, the pileated woodpecker. Those big oval excavations that you'll often see in dead trees are their feeding cavities. Nest cavities would be a smaller hole, not the big, wide, open, oval things that often see. So difference between feeding and nesting cavities. We also like to see live trees with cavities. This is hard to see, but that's an aspen. The red circle is highlighting a small hole, cavity. So that's a live aspen tree. And this bird created that hole. Anybody know what that is? Yellow-bellied sapsucker. Sounds like something straight out of a Bugs Bunny cartoon. But yellow-bellied sapsuckers are one of our migratory woodpecker species. You'll often find them doing those sap wells like the birch that it's on there. So you see these rows of holes. That's what they'll do they'll make those rolls, come back, feed on the sap, and feed on insects that have been attracted to the sap. But they'll make holes in declining aspen, which they have identified as, they know somehow that there's some decay in the center, and it makes a perfect nesting cavity for them to raise their young. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, kind of on the management side, just the timing. If we are going to be doing active forest management, what's the right time to be doing that? Ideally, conditions like we see right there, like we have right now. Frozen ground, snow on the ground. Actually, this was just from this past week, got to get up to a harvest that we've been involved in the Little River State Park on state lands. And this helps protect soils when we do it in frozen ground conditions. Although there are some tree species that we might want to try to grow and regenerate, the small seeded ones like yellow birch and white pine, where we want to kind of scarify the soil so that seed can get into the mineral soil. But ideally, because this is the time when the birds aren't nesting. So if we can avoid the time when the birds are nesting, that's great. If we can't, it is important to recognize that people in the forest products industry need to make a living. And if we only say, you can only do it when the ground's frozen, that's not going to really work, especially, this year is the anomaly, right? Because we've had how many winters in a row where we get freeze thaws, and a lot of these harvesting operations, they stop because they can't work in the woods when it's thawed like that. But ideally, it is these frozen ground conditions from a bird perspective that we might suggest happen. And I just want to end with a couple of final thoughts on all of this. First one is a quote from Aldo Leopold. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And I think one of the greatest disservices that has happened over time is we as humans have gotten disconnected from the land. We don't see ourselves as part of it. We see nature as that, and this is us. And when that happens, it can create some very unfortunate situations where we don't appreciate anymore that we are part of that landscape, that our ability, that we rely upon forests to give us the things we need, and we can manage them in ways that support us while doing it to support the other biodiversity and other creatures that are out there. So I would ask all of you to see yourself as part of the land, not as something that is separate from nature. We're part of that same community. The other thing is striking a balance. I heard mention about the importance of old growth. We want old growth. We don't want to see every acre of forest land being managed. We want to have some areas that are left alone as reserves that can kind of do their own thing. We want some areas that we manage with these ecological principles that we've talked about. And some areas, just based on their condition today, might require a little heavier hand to manage them, to try to restore them. It's restoration forestry in that sense, trying to restore their health back to them because of some of the mismanagement of the past. And it's a balance between all of these things. Anytime we say we want just one thing from our forests, we run into trouble. Anytime we focus on one goal, there are unintended consequences to all the other important values that our forests provide us and that we ask of them. So we need to think holistically and create this balanced approach about how we think about stewarding our forest resources. And the last but not least is this great quote by Dr. Thomas Lovejoy: if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. because birds are good ambassadors. They, again, are indicators of ecosystem health. We take care of them. We're taking care of a lot of other things as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and beautiful barred owl that was just yesterday at our Green Mountain Audubon Center, perched right on the sign there, as if it knew something, which is awesome. I appreciate your attention and thoughts and questions and responses to my questions. Now we can take questions and have some conversation from all of you. So thank you. Yeah.
What effect has the prevalence of pellet heat had on our forests? Pellet generally goes for the scrubbier stuff that's down lower.
So the question is about the impact that the pellet industry has had on our forests. I'm probably not the best person to speak to it because I don't know in detail where the pellets are coming from. What I will say, going back to one of the slides, is we do really think it's important to leave tops in the forest, to leave mess in the forest, and to not, as general practice, be doing what's called whole tree harvesting, where we take a tree, use mechanized machinery to cut it, and then pull the entire tree from the forest. We'd like to see those tops left as often as they can be. Sometimes that is hard to do because to make the timber harvest economically viable, there has to be more than just the bowls, the logs themselves. Even though there's not a huge value in the tops. Nonetheless, it does happen. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that at all, but I would say that as a general practice, it'd be best to avoid it if we're thinking about all these other goals that we have for our forests. The pellet thing, again, I don't know what part those are being manufactured from to give you an answer I'd be comfortable giving you. So, yes?
How do you feel Act 250 has contributed to Vermont's forestry management?
Act 250 to forest management? I would.
Continued forestry, yeah.
Yeah. So Act 250 really, as our land use law to keep open space open, doesn't necessarily get into the management as much of those forests as things like our current use program for private landowners would. So Act 250 has done a great job of keeping our forests as forests, right? But then that's important. You have to have forests first and foremost. But it's then how are those forests stewarded and taken care of that becomes the next important question. So it's not enough to just say this forest is protected, necessarily. There could be a very strong need to restore that forest through how we manage it. Current use, if I'll take the liberty of kind of going to that question next, use value appraisal program or current use, anyone familiar with that? So it's a program that as a forest landowner, if you have 25 or more contiguous acres, you can enroll that forest land in what's called the current use, or technically it's use value appraisal. You are being taxed at the value of that forest as forest land, as opposed to it as at its development value. And it allows landowners to hold on to land and not feel the financial need to sell it because they can't afford to have the land. To me, that program has done a huge amount of good for Vermont's forests, and our forests are the way we engage with forests, the way wildlife and biodiversity engages is part of the forest. In part, current use has really done a good thing for that, because to be in current use, you have to have a forest management plan written by, now, a Vermont licensed forester and approved by the county foresters, who are state of Vermont employees. And those county foresters are good foresters who are thinking about the forest holistically. And I read a lot of forest management plans in my work, and I can tell you with full certainty and honesty here today, it's hard to go to any other state in this country and find forest land that is managed as well as Vermont's forests. Because many other states don't have the same kinds of programs as current use, and if they do, they don't have the same rigor behind the requirements of enrolling in that. We have it really good here in Vermont when it comes to forests relative to other places, for sure. Yeah.
I have a question about the gaps and the openings. It seems like invasives like disturbed areas. How much do you have to actively work to get rid of the invasives in forest management, as opposed to will the forest take care of itself at all?
You have to do it, right? And I appreciate the question. So if you are going to do some management and create gaps, if you have invasives, it is important to try to treat those, remove those if you can, before you do anything. When you don't have a lot of invasives and they're just kind of scattered individuals here and there, that's the time. We say early detection, rapid response. Like get out there regularly and often when you find something, pull it and try to get the whole root. There are actual tools that are designed for removing some of those plants. Once they become pervasive and like are everywhere, your ability to manually control them tanks. And you have to consider other ways of doing that. But, and I've heard this argument before, a concern that if we do a gap, we're going to get invasives. The paralysis that comes from that fear is unfortunate because it means that we don't do anything. So we need to be aware that this is a potential to happen. If we're going to create gaps, we might have this happen. And we have to commit to the resources to dealing with the problem. But to say, let's not do anything in our woods because of invasives is not the way to go. So, yeah.
So we had a farm in southern Vermont, and we stopped we shoot some of the fields, went back wild. It was part of the Vermont Land Trust as well as current use. And two things. One, like, there's a lot of like juniper and buckthorn that just grew super fast. And it's kind of hard to keep up with. I don't know if it has any value to birds. I guess that's one question.
Not the buckthorn.
Right.
No.
I don't need value to anything. And, but, you know, as far as the Vermont Land Trust, I mean, as much as I appreciate it, you know, they required a management plan every 10 years. And, you know, there were some things, I mean, we really wanted to let it be wild, you know, because you do, as much as there's gaps might be great for some of these birds that probably weren't here 200 years ago, you know, the native larger species, how do you balance that, you know, with creating gaps and then creating too many gaps where the bigger animals find that difficult, you know.
I don't know if folks heard the question. The question was around, I'll kind of go to the last part of it about whether the gaps, creating gaps and frequent gaps or larger gaps, what's the impact on some of the larger wildlife species that might be out there, like black bear, perhaps. I'm putting words in your mouth now. So wildlife benefits from disturbance. I said birds, but wildlife in general will benefit from different levels of disturbance. Black bears love blackberries and raspberries. And we find blackberries and raspberries growing in disturbed areas where there's been a gap in the canopy that some sunlight is reaching the ground. Creating gaps and forest management in general is not forest fragmentation. We are not taking that forest and converting it to something else. That's the problem for the moose and the bear and the other wildlife, is when it's no longer a forest. Gaps are just resetting the successional clock. All vegetation goes through a period of succession where it changes over time due to environmental conditions. And we're just doing what nature would do on a regular basis, which is put small gaps in the canopy That's how our forests renew themselves and get new growth coming back in. But it is not something that is fragmenting the forest. We hear it's real. Forest fragmentation is real. Creating gaps is not that. So I would say that it's actually a benefit. Those gaps are a benefit to the wildlife that you were speaking to, and not preventing them from being in that area. Yes?
You describe some of the bird species and change in bird populations that might happen as forests get either like heavily disturbed or fragmented. For example, I'm kind of thinking about like the cowbird and just some of the species that we don't necessarily want to see. Can you help us? Can you paint that picture, please?
Yeah, so like what kind of bird communities come in when we disturb areas? Usually it's when we convert forest or any landscape from a natural setting to a human-dominated setting that this happens. Difference would be the cowbird you mentioned. Brown-headed cowbirds are a species that we find in more open and agricultural settings. Historically, they were birds of the Midwest, and they followed the buffalo herds as they moved across the plains. So they would not build a nest and lay their eggs and stay there incubating it, hatching, feeding their young. They would put their eggs in the nest of some other bird, a host, and go on their way. And we find that happening still. It happens in Vermont. I would not say it's the biggest threat that our birds face. We call it nest parasitism. So the cowbird lays its egg in a wood thrush nest. The cowbird hatches. It is a bigger bird than the wood thrush young. It will outcompete the wood thrush young, usually getting all the food. And so it comes at a loss then to the bird species that we hoped would be successfully nesting, that being the thrush. It's still a problem in more fragmented landscapes where there's more agriculture. But again, it does happen here, not one of the biggest threats that our birds face. Other things would just be more generalist birds, so jays, crows, and things like that, which we're not saying are bad, but fragmented landscapes are the places where we find more generalist wildlife. And the birds that I showed you here today are more specialists, habitat specialists. They require, the wood thrush, the black-throated blue warbler, require large blocks of interior forest. It can have gaps and disturbance, but it has to be forested area, not fragmented into smaller blocks. So the change in land condition and conversion to non-forest is when we see the biggest turnover in bird communities to these more generalist species. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to maybe report or duty to report. There's some pushback on ecological forestry, and it's a pretty hot topic actually these days. A little aside, the current use program, just a little aside. I wish on the agricultural side of things, the plans for agriculture didn't necessitate you cutting your field. You could let that in current use program, and I hope they do. These large swaths where there's no insects in there, there's nothing but a cut field for somebody's beautiful view.
Right.
But if current use changed that and let that happen with landowners, I'd hope that would be a vantage point where people would go that route rather than what I see in the pictures I've seen, Ethan Tapper pictures and some of the pictures you showed here, where it does seem fragmented. And what I really wanted to report is President Biden had a thrust to protect biodiversity and old growth, and it didn't go anywhere because the Forest Service didn't pay any attention. And I don't know if you all noticed, but his time's up. Biden's gone. Nothing happened with that. Yeah.
So there were, I take all of your points. Yep.
So that opportunity was lost. It wasn't enforced, and the Forest Service and telephone gap here in the state of Vermont and Putnam State Forest. Ecological forestry is this new, why is byword the correct word? But it's the way people are talking, and I hope that ecological forestry, which you're saying, is enforced.
Mm-hmm.
When the skidders come in, they don't have weed seeds on them, and just on and on. And there's so much nuance to it. but the deep interior is what is really suffering, and that's what's holding carbon, and that's what's holding a whole host of species that are deep interior. You can't have an interior like the map you showed about what you do over 6 years. There wasn't a lot of old growth in there that was never touched because that looked pretty fragmented. Of course, maybe it wasn't to scale, but I'll just end by saying that something along the long-eared bat, some of these species, they won't have a place. And a lot of the pictures I've seen in ecological forestry, it looks very barren versus you look at pictures of the Adirondack Park where this is moisture. This is never going to catch on fire, for one thing. It is so deep. So I'll just...
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So there's a lot there, and I won't, and I'm very familiar with the criticisms right now about ecological forestry. Audubon Vermont in particular has been identified as a group that has not been advocating for protecting old growth forests. I will say right here and now that that is not true. It comes to how folks are defining things, and there's a lot there. In terms of the National Old Growth Amendment that you referred to that the Biden administration brought forth, there was movement forward with that. That is now gone, as you mentioned and alluded to, unfortunately with the new administration. But the U.S. Forest Service had come up with, for the first time ever, some plans for how to identify old growth on national forest lands, U.S. Forest Service, and that was a positive thing. We have very little old growth in Vermont, very little. And I don't know of anyone who says we should be cutting trees in Vermont's old growth forests. And I'll stop right there with that question. Sean, how we doing?
We're good. We have time for a couple more questions.
Okay.
I'm going to steal one of them, if that's all right.
Okay.
So, I'm curious about how somehow this connects to what you're just talking about. I'm curious about how you think about timescales when you're writing a forest stewardship plan. You are writing prescriptions for creating certain disturbances, and but also trying to remember that there's all these natural disturbances that are going to be happening to this forest over the next decades and centuries, and you don't know what they're going to be or when they're going to be. We know that a lot of these disturbance regimes are changing and accelerating, that sort of thing. So how do you factor in the forest's ability to have its own disturbances on top of prescriptions that you're doing as well in your stewardship plans?
It's a great question. So first and foremost, those forest management plans on private lands, it was mentioned here before, they're for a 10-year time period, and they need to be updated to reflect current conditions, ownership goal changes, anything like that. So the planning process for that plan is 10 years. That's way too short to be thinking about forests. Forests operate in different timescales than we can even comprehend. We don't work in those timeframes as human beings. So there's a little bit of a challenge right there to make that work. When it comes to thinking about the natural disturbance regimes, how they are changing in a changing climate, and what does that mean for planning, one of the things that we first and foremost look to is Vermont conservation design. If folks are not familiar with that document, it is something produced by the Agency of Natural Resources that has targets for, throughout the state of Vermont, how much old forest would we like to see, how much young forest would we like to see, and gives places where it's most appropriate to create or to try to create those conditions. On the young forest side of things there, statewide, the goal is to have 3 to 5% of the forest in patches that are at least 1 acre in size. They might even say 2 acres, I'm not sure, we'd have to look at it. That are between 0 and 20 years of age. So that 0 to 20 year time frame of a forest growing from disturbance is when we tend to see the young forest in those big enough patches persist. Beyond 20 years, it's now grown too tall, shaded in. The low dense growth that the chestnut-sided warbler was looking for now is shaded out. So it's that 0 to 20 year time frame in most situations we're looking for. 3 to 5% of the state in a young forest condition, 0 to 20 years of age. We're nowhere near that right now based on the data that we have. We're somewhere around 1%. So we can still create more of that. Audubon Vermont, even before Vermont Conservation Design was published, also was suggesting 3 to 5% of the landscape be in these young forest conditions based off of what we know pre-settlement forests and natural disturbance patterns. There's some great papers out there, peer-reviewed literature, about what the New England interior and coastal landscape may have looked like prior to colonization in terms of these different habitat conditions. For this part of Vermont, it was probably 1 to 3% young forest at any time, usually due to beavers' influence, creating those shrubby conditions. So we said 3 to 5, but we also know that that happens naturally, so generally we go on the lower side. So within a landscape, if I'm working with a landowner, I don't just think about their property. I look on a map at 2,500 acres around them, what we call landscape, and we try to identify what's the condition of that landscape. If there's young forest out there, I'm probably not going to recommend it on your land because it's already there. If it's not, I might say, if we find a good place to do this, an acre gap, or maybe a 2-acre gap. So we try to take what we know about natural disturbance, what we don't know those natural disturbance events will be in the future, and the landscape context to answer that question, knowing full well that most likely these events are going to happen more frequently and perhaps opening up more of that canopy gap naturally. So we don't necessarily need to do it all the time, but it doesn't mean we can just walk away and not do it, because it might not happen. We just don't know. There are no right answers to this. It's complex. There's a joke that forestry is not like brain surgery. It's harder. I don't think that's true, but I've never tried brain surgery, but I can tell you that it's just complex and it's very nuanced. I heard you mentioned nuance, and there's so much nuance in this stuff that sometimes it's hard to kind of wrap your head around. You got a question? Oh, yeah.
I sort of have several.
Okay.
I'm going to start with a really specific bird question, which is the black-throated blue warblers was a very short time for them to do. How many clutches do they go through in this? It seems like they must have several clutches in those.
Yeah. The question is for the black-throated blue warbler, how many clutches or times do they nest and produce young? It'll vary. I mean, it might be once. It could be up to 3 times, depending on the individual pair. Whether or not we're successful the first time or not will trigger attempt to do another one. But certainly not more than 3 on any of these. There just isn't enough time. I mean, it sounds really lovely, like birdsong in summer, and we're all like, oh, it's so wonderful. It's like a race for them to get all this stuff happening. There's an urgency there, and so time is of the essence. If I'm not nesting and rearing young until late July, it's going to be hard for them to be ready to go in late September.
And then my other specific bird question is related to your barred owl here. I love barred owls. However, I have discovered that they are, confirmed for me that they come in and they chase out the other species. And I'm sort of becoming more aware of that. I think about, I grew up on Lake Champlain in the summers, and we'd have at least 5 different species of owls in the summers, and now only thing we have there are barred owls. And I'm just wondering about, and I've noticed just since living back here in Vermont, coming back after having been gone for 25 years, all I hear are barred owls over and I'm on the Niagara Valley.
Yeah.
It strikes me as odd to go out on a moonlight ski and not hear multiple species of owls.
Yeah, so.
Is that part of that loss?
Well, I think it's more of a factor of just in Vermont, where do we find different species of owls? The Champlain Valley is going to have a greater diversity of owls. Great horned, barred, screech, barn perhaps, although those have really declined. Whereas the Mad River Valley, I live in Waterbury Center. I've never heard a great horned owl. I've never heard a screech owl. And I think that's just, it's those birds, the great horn and the screech, tend to be more in those open and forested woodlot kind of places, as opposed to lots of interior forest. So I think it's just a function of geography, more so than barred owls chasing out, because the great horn would most likely chase them out if they were there.
Well, the Champlain, I don't want to keep it, but the Champlain Valley, we used to have multiple species and
Okay.
property there, and now we've had the property for 100 years. So obviously more than my age, but it now only has barred owls in the. It's 100 acres mile or so along the footing. So it's just odd, and so I know I'm sure you're familiar with the whole situation that was with barred owls.
Yeah, right. So, so that would be something, I don't have an answer for you then in that case, but we would look at like the Vermont Breeding Bird Atlas to kind of see what's the change from the 70s and 80s to more recent things. So, what you're saying, I would suspect that there's been a loss in where those birds are being picked up, but exactly why is another question. So.
Yeah, we'll
Okay.
have to wrap things up here. Folks, feel free to come on up and hang out if you want to ask some more questions. I also want to invite folks to head to our website, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations. It has all the recordings of all the other programs in this series and previous years as well. So if you want to catch up, then do that. And that's your homework before coming back next week for our talk. So,
Great.
Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.